Hello and welcome to Dialogue. NATO's annual summit has opened in The Hague, where leaders are expected to debate a bold new proposal, raising defense spending to 5% of GDP. The gathering comes at a time of heightened geopolitical turbulence, from the ongoing war in Ukraine to the rapidly escalating crisis in the Middle East. How will NATO members handle their internal divisions over rising budget demands? Is the U.S. shifting its role within the alliance? And how consistent is NATO's approach to the many regional conflicts unfolding across the globe? Join us for today's discussion live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet, Chair Professor of Renmin University of China, Victor Gao Zhikai, Chair Professor at Soochow University, Warwick Powell, Senior Fellow at Taihe Institute, and Professor Diesen from University of South-Eastern Norway. Welcome to the show. So, Yiwei, I will start with you. The summit and its final declaration are expected to touch upon basically what Donald Trump has been calling for member states of NATO to increase their military spending to 5% of their separate GDPs. What's the background of increasing with such a large extent?
Well, President Trump claimed that the majorities of the NATO members, they are free rider. It's under the U.S. Leadership. The U.S. contributed 70% of the budget before. And so that is unfair. So they need to pay more from 2% and to 5% of the GDP for military budget. So that's basically to change the responsibility between U.S. and European countries.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, you are, from one of the European countries here. How do you see this increase of 5% to 5%, and how will they spend that to purchase U.S. arms?
Well, that's part of the question. I think that Europeans would like to increase their own economies by shifting over to more European arms manufacturing, as there is a mood now to pursue some military Keynesianism. As Europe is deindustrializing, there's economic stagnation, if not even decline. So remilitarization is seen as a possibility to revive some of the industries, at least until the warehouses are full, which this is usually when the military Keynesianism runs into problem. But overall, it's not everyone who's following the 5% goal. I think a lot of this is also to win over the loyalty or support from the United States. A key concern now in Europe is that NATO doesn't really have that much of a goal anymore, and much of a purpose, especially if the United States doesn't consider Russia to be an enemy to be fought. If the US wants to walk away from Ukraine, the concern is it will also walk away from Europe. So if you see countries like the United Kingdom, there are some indications that they're simply shuffling numbers around to count, for example, infrastructure projects as rearmament to boost the percentages of and reach those 5%. And so it doesn't necessarily result in greater military capabilities. I think a lot of this is to please Trump, to make it appear that the Europeans are loyal and, if not obedient, partners of the United States. So the US will not leave Europe at this point in time when America is prioritizing differently and Europe is no longer on top of the list.
Well, speak of pleasing the Americans or Donald Trump personally, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, sent a private message to Trump saying that, praising him for, making Europe, quote, pay in big way. And another quote, he was quoted by saying that Daddy sometimes has to use tough language. What does that reflect, this relationship between Europe and the US? Glenn, please.
Well, it's a very subordinate relationship. I mean, it's even J.D. Vance at one point said that America doesn't need vassals. It needs partners who can stand on their own feet. But the European leaders appear to be bending over backwards to show their subordination to the United States. Again, punishing, asking the U.S. to take to speak tough with the Europeans, to make them behave. It's quite extraordinary that this is the language. Of course, some of it is also to probably appeal to Trump's ego that yes, he's tough on us, but that's the only way we will learn. And essentially, yes, celebrating him because at least you saw similar mentality throughout the first administration. The idea that let's just stroke Trump's ego and then wait until he goes away. So it might be a lot of the same thing we're seeing now, but obviously this idea that if the Europeans can only show enough obedience to the United States, then the US will not depart Europe. In my opinion, though, I think Europe is only making itself less and less relevant by bending over backwards in this way.
Okay, less and less irrelevant. Victor, of course, 5% increase, that means like you spend much less on welfare, on public goods. So that means challenges probably for a lot of European governments. Some of them are struggling with economic growth. And despite that, Trump has said that, he's not really committed to Article 5 for collective defense. So that put the European countries at a, let's say, awkward situation?
First of all, increasing the military budget to 5% of the member countries' GDP will not make NATO stronger. It will not make European members of NATO stronger. It probably will accelerate their relative economic decline because it will really divert a lot of resources for military spending. And if they really consider Russia to be their principal adversary, Russia is both a conventional weapon country as well as a military nuclear weapon country. Now, secondly, for European countries which will eventually succumb to the pressure of President Trump, I would call it a typical case of appeasement of Trump. I think President Trump's desire is very clear. He wants to milk the European cows for the benefit of the defense industry of the United States. Trump called Europe worse than China. Allow me to emphasize, China's not that bad and Europe is not that worse. So when you deal with President Trump of the United States, you need to deal with him as he is, rather than try to make him happier, for example, because that will probably further embolden President Trump. And now that we know President Trump and the US government now have a special relationship with Russia, you really cannot deal with Russia in that way. I would say the European countries need to recognize that by excluding Russia, you do not have lasting peace for Europe. By excluding Russia, you do not have lasting peace for the world. So it is much better to come up with a more philosophical solution of the tensions faced by Europe, rather than going jingoistic and try to rearm itself to 5%, which may actually further erode security arrangement in Europe, rather than strengthening that.
Well, good point there. Warwick, if you look at NATO, despite, of course, their tension with Russia, Russia as a neighbor will be there forever. And NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte talked about so-called Asian concern, particularly China. They say basically they are trying to expand the NATO operation to Asia to contain the rise of China. What do you make of that?
You're asking
Look, this
me?
is clearly a function of
Warwick,
30
please.
years of relevance. This is clearly a continuation of a diminishing relevance over the course of the last 35 years. Let's not forget, NATO ostensibly was a defensive alliance, which is a misnomer in and of itself, established ostensibly to deal with the so-called Soviet threat. When that threat disappeared in 1991, there was actually no fundamental reason for NATO's continued existence, and yet, of course, it's fabricated reasons thereafter to maintain relevance. It's struggling to deliver peace on the continent for which it is principally responsible, and now it seeks to generate conflicts and divisions and animosities in other parts of the world to rationalize its own continued existence. This is just straight up relevance deprivation. And the last thing that Asia needs is the cancer that has been NATO. One of the principal causes of regional instability in Europe is NATO's own expansionary ambitions over the course of the last 30 years. So why on earth would anyone in Asia want that coming into our region? Beats me.
Interesting, following up on that, we see for this year's NATO summit, of course, there's the absence of Japanese Prime Minister, South Korean President, and of course, Australian Prime Minister. What do you make of that?
Well, it's a reflection of the fact that countries in the region, notwithstanding their own various localized concerns on the security front with each other, recognize that NATO does not actually play a useful role, and that the long-run security of the region is enhanced not by bringing NATO's influence into the region, but by ensuring that NATO's malign influence is kept well and truly away. There are ways in which the region can shape a security architecture that suits the requirements of the region. And the lessons to be learned from the NATO experience over the course of the last 30-odd years is that creating blocks of one side pitted against the other is not a pathway to long-term peace. It's very understandable in the current environment for the Republic of Korea and for Japan to demonstrate a deep reluctance to go down this pathway, and their absence at the summit speaks volumes, as does indeed Australia's.
Yiwei, of course, what's also noticeable is, right before the summit, Mark Rutte talked about U.S. strikes on Iran, the bombing, his insistence that that's not in violation of international law, despite it's evident, right? You are bombing a sovereign nation without approval, authorization from the UN Security Council. It's against the law. Somehow people say that's double standards, right? Special operation in Ukraine by Russians or special operation by Israelis, by US. If, either they are in the law or they are against the law, you cannot say one is okay, the other is violating the law. And so why was he speaking about in that way?
Well, if you read the NATO constitution, it says very clearly that it's follow the constitution of the UN. That means you should respect the sovereignty of the member states, not just the NATO members, but also the UN member. And the claim is defensive. Actually, you say double standard. Even go further, it's not like that. For instance, when we talk about the NATO expansion, then the NATO members will criticize you. It's not an expansion, it's enlargement. So it should be sooner or later, like today's Ukraine should be sooner or later be a member of Ukraine because it's a European civilization. Actually, NATO is not just a military ally, it's also traced back to the Roman Empire expansion. So the views of Russia and Iran, even China, which we say Western-centric mindset. So the Russia and China and those without so-called renaissance, they are not accept the universal values. So they are on behalf of the civilization, you are barbarism or semi-barbarisms. Even China used to be the civilization, Asian civilization. But the modern civilization is traced back to universal values. It's Europeans and the US is the West. So in this regard, we criticize of the NATO. Actually, when the Warsaw Treaty Organization and the Soviet Union collapsed, why NATO still exists? Actually, it's defense so-called the Western values. It's like of the Roman Empire still exists in today's world. So that's basically the reason of the so-called double standard.
Well, Glenn, it used to be the case of the past years, Ukraine tops the agenda of NATO summit, NATO meetings. What about this year?
Well, it's Ukraine obviously has a lower priority this year because a lot of things have changed compared to, well, even last year. That is, no one is really seriously suggesting that Ukraine is winning anymore. For a long time, this was the argument, even though it was not the case. But you can't really hide the losses anymore. That is that Ukraine's suffering from a shortage of men, also shortage of weapons, and we can also see a shortage now of external political support, given that Trump is not that interested more in the Ukraine war. He would like to bring it to an end, and this fits into the wider efforts by the United States to shift its priorities away from Europe and towards Asia, but also more in the Middle East, I think, above Europe. So furthermore, diplomacy has begun. It took more than 3 years to sit down and begin and talk to the Russians. So there's a lot of things that appears to be at least moving along. So there's a much less consensus now within NATO, and any discussion of Ukraine could merely make it more evident that there's not consensus anymore. Obviously, there's efforts by the Europeans who would like to replace the United States, that is to be able to supply what America is no longer supplying. But a lot of this is very much divorced from reality. So Ukraine will still have a spot there, but it's not going to be the central focus as we saw in the previous years.
Well, let's take a short break and we'll be back right after this.